The kitchen window on Mill Hollow Road faced east, and at 4 in the morning on a Tuesday in February of 2026, there was nothing yet for it to face. Hazel Carraway sat at the oak table in her late husband Walter's house, which had been her house for 46 years and was now only her house, and she counted the bills one more time. She had counted them at midnight. She had counted them at 2. She would count them again at 6 when the sky finally bothered to come up. $52,847. That was the figure. That was the cancer bill, the one the insurance had not covered, the one the hospital had been polite about for the first 6 months, and then steadily less polite for the 8 that followed. Walter had been gone. 14 months. The bills, somehow, were still alive. Hazel was 72 years old. Her Social Security check was $1,247 a month. Her property tax was $1,800 a year. Her electric bill in February ran just under $100. She had run the math so many times in her head that the math no longer felt like math. It felt like a song she had memorized by force. And like all Force songs, it would not leave her alone, even when she begged it to. The overhead bulb in the kitchen buzzed faintly. The pipes ticked from the cold. The cat, an old gray tabby named Tilly, who had outlived 2 of her sisters, slept on the radiator with her chin tucked against the iron. Walter had named her. Walter had named most of the cats. Walter was not here to name the next one. Out the kitchen window, past the bare maple and the side yard where she had buried the dog last summer, Hazel could see the corner of the barn. The barn she could not afford to repaint. The barn she had been told twice by her daughter Susan would fall in on itself by next winter. Susan lived in Lexington, an hour north. Susan worked at a law firm and dressed for the weather of a downtown office, and did not understand why anyone would still keep chickens. Susan called every Sunday and most Wednesdays, and the call always ended the same way. "Mama, please consider Cedar Grove. They have a waiting list. They have a craft room. They have a chapel." Hazel did not want a craft room. Hazel did not want a chapel. Hazel wanted to sit in this kitchen with the cat and the buzzing bulb and the impossible math, and she wanted, more than she had wanted, anything in 14 months, for the kitchen window to face something other than the dark. She folded the bills back into the manila envelope they lived in. She put the envelope back in the drawer with the rubber bands and the coupons, in the way that you put a wound back under a bandage when you cannot do anything about it just yet. She pushed her thumb against the lid of the coffee tin and pried it open. She made coffee. The coffee maker was 30 years old, and ground its way through a pot the way a grandfather clock grinds through a long minute. While the coffee brewed, she picked up the Holloway Sentinel. The Tuesday paper Lloyd from the post office dropped on her porch every week even though her subscription had lapsed in December. Lloyd was kind that way. Lloyd's own wife had died in 2019, and Lloyd understood things a man did not have to be told. She read the obituaries first the way her mother had, then the church bulletin, then the high school basketball scores. She was on page 7, half attentive, when her eyes caught on a small boxed notice 3 inches by 2, set apart from the rest of the column. Town auction. Holloway service station and lot. 414 Old Cumberland Pike. Minimum bid $10. Tuesday, 9 in the morning at the courthouse. Contact B. Pruitt, town clerk. She read it once. She read it again. She set the paper down. 414 Old Cumberland Pike was the building she had grown up calling Daddy's place. She did not move for a long time. When the coffee maker finally clicked, she poured a cup with hands steadier than they should have been, and she drank it standing at the window, and she watched the dark slowly forget itself into morning. The courthouse in Holloway sat at the top end of Main Street where the old elms had once met overhead, and where now only their stumps remained, sawed flat after the blight of 2017 and never replaced. The building itself was red brick with white columns and a clock tower that still ran on a man named Roy, who came up once a month to wind it. Hazel had stood on these steps for her wedding photographs in 1974, in a white lace dress her mother had let out at the waist 3 times before settling. She had stood on these steps in 1989 to pay her property taxes the year the silo collapsed. She had stood on these steps in 2024, 3 weeks after Walter died, to file a small claim against the cable company that had charged her for service to a house her husband had not lived in for a month. She had not, however, stood on these steps with $10.34 in coins jingling in a mason jar. The jar was the one she used for the church collection plate, which had been Walter's job to fill. Since November, she had been adding to it from her coat pockets and her sock drawer and the change tray of the old Chevrolet, never sure whether she was saving for the church or for a moment exactly like this one. The jar weighed about as much as a small cat. She held it against her chest as she climbed the steps and pushed through the heavy oak door. The town clerk's office was on the first floor at the end of the hall, behind a frosted glass door stenciled in cracked black paint. She knocked once and stepped inside. Bobby Pruitt was the town clerk now. He was 36 and looked 19. His mother, Janet, had taught Hazel's high school typing class in 1968. Bobby wore a flannel shirt and a pair of bifocals and was eating a donut over a paper plate at his desk. He looked up, set down the donut, and wiped his fingers on a napkin. "Mrs. Carraway, Mama said you'd come by." Hazel set the jar on his counter. "I'm here about the station," she said. "414 Old Cumberland." Bobby did not laugh, which she appreciated because she had been half afraid he would. "Ma'am, that lot has been on offer for 14 months. Nobody bid. The building is a wreck. There's no septic. The pumps don't work. There's a pin oak coming down on one corner. I have to tell you all of that." "Yes, sir." "You want it anyway." "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached under the counter and pulled out a file folder, opened it, and began counting the coins in the jar. He counted them 3 times. He looked up. $10.34. "The 34 cents is church money," Hazel said. "If you give me the 34 cents back, I'll put it in the plate Sunday." Bobby slid 4 dimes across the counter. She tucked them in her coat pocket. He filled out 3 forms in long blue handwriting and turned them toward her. She signed in the spaces he tapped. He stamped each form with a notary's seal that was older than he was. He slipped the forms back into the folder and slid a small brass key on a leather fob across the counter to her. The fob was blackened with age. It was stamped, faintly, in worn block letters. Tipton's Texaco, Holloway key. She did not pick the key up immediately. She let it sit there between them on the counter, and she looked at it. And she felt the courthouse floor shift slightly under her feet. Not from any actual movement, but from the way the world shifts when a thing you had thought lost is, all at once, in front of you again. Bobby cleared his throat. "You all right, Mrs. Carraway?" "I'm fine, Bobby. Thank you, son." She picked up the key. She slid it into her coat pocket with the 4 dimes. She walked back down the courthouse hall the way she had walked down it as a bride and as a widow and as a mother, now this morning, something she did not yet have a word for. She pushed open the oak door and stepped out into the February cold and stood for a long time on the top step, holding nothing now in her hands, holding everything else. She decided to drive over that same afternoon. She did not call Susan. She did not call Ruth at the bakery. She put on her thick cream cardigan and her brown leather work boots, picked up the brass key from the kitchen counter where she had left it next to the coffee tin, and got into the old Chevrolet. The drive from Mill Hollow Road to the corner of Old Cumberland Pike and Spruce Street was 11 minutes if you obeyed the speed limit, and 7 if you did not. Hazel obeyed the speed limit. The road went past the Christian church, past the Donnelly bakery where she could see Ruth through the front window setting out a fresh tray of bread, past the post office where Lloyd waved at her without recognizing her behind the windshield. She passed the volunteer fire station and the old Pratt feed store that had become a tanning salon, and then the dollar store that had been new in 2009 and now looked tired. She turned left onto Spruce Street. She drove 3 blocks. She parked at the curb of 414 Old Cumberland Pike, and she sat in the car for a full 10 minutes before she opened the driver's side door. She had not walked the lot in 30 years. The last time she had walked the lot had been in 1995, when she was 41, when she had come over here on a winter Saturday and stood in the cold and tried to make herself feel her father's hands on her shoulders. She had stood there for half an hour that day, and she had felt nothing at all, and she had decided then that her father was gone from her for good and she had not come back. Now she came back. The Texaco star sign was still bolted to the pole above her head. The paint was bleached to a soft cream white, the red rim almost faded to pink. 3 bulbs along the lower edge of the sign were missing, leaving dark sockets. The metal frame was rust-streaked from 60 winters. The pole leaned very slightly to the south. The pumps stood beneath their canopy like 2 old soldiers who had not been told the war was over. They were the old style, with the glass cylinder tops, the kind that let you watch the gallons go up, the kind a man had to hand crank to reset. The hoses were cracked. The brass nozzles were green with verdigris. The pump faces, once cherry red, were now the color of an old brick washed by too much rain. The little white clapboard office leaned slightly to the east. A pin oak had dropped half its branches across the canopy. The front window was filmed with 60 years of road dust. A torn paper sign on the inside of the glass, yellowed beyond reading, flapped in the cold breeze coming up Spruce Street. She walked across the cracked asphalt apron to the front door. She fitted the brass key into the lock. The lock turned more easily than she had expected, as if it had been waiting. The door stuck. She pushed harder with her shoulder. It opened with a long, low groan, the way an old man groans when he stands up after a nap. The smell hit her at once. Old engine oil, mildew, wood smoke from a stove gone cold 60 years ago, and underneath all of it, faint and stubborn and exact, the sweet smell of pipe tobacco. Her father had smoked a pipe. She stood in the doorway and did not move. The interior was a museum. A small Texaco-branded wall calendar hung on a nail above a black coal stove. The page opened to December 1962 with a thick red circle around the 17th. A green metal Coca-Cola thermometer hung beside it, mercury frozen at 31 degrees. 2 metal folding chairs sat by the stove. A counter ran along the back wall, polished oak, with a tall national brass cash register sitting dead center, gleaming faintly under 60 years of dust. A glass display case to one side held the desiccated ghosts of candy bars in their original wrappers: Mounds, Sky Bar, Goo Goo Cluster, Bonomo, Turkish Taffy. The Texaco wall clock above the door had stopped at 8:47. The chair behind the counter was a plain wooden ladder back with a worn cushion tied to the seat with twine. It was her father's chair. She knew it the way you know your own front step. She stood in the doorway, and she did not move, and she let the smell of pipe tobacco and old oil in December 1962 walk slowly into her lungs and do whatever it needed to do in her chest. The wind picked up outside. The Texaco sign creaked on its pole. Somewhere in the rafters, a single drop of melting snow fell onto the floor, and the small bright sound of it landing was the only sound in the world. She came every morning for 6 days. She drove over after her coffee and stayed until lunch. She brought a thermos. She brought a metal pail and a bag of clean rags torn from Walter's old undershirts. She brought a stiff bristled broom from the barn. She brought a can of Murphy's oil soap and a bottle of vinegar and a roll of brown paper towels. She did not tell Susan. She did not tell Ruth. She told no one. On Wednesday, Ruth saw the old Chevrolet drive past the bakery window 3 mornings in a row at 8:15. And Ruth, who had known Hazel since the 2nd grade and who had stood beside her at Walter's funeral with one warm hand on the small of her back, came out onto the sidewalk on Thursday morning with a paper sack and flagged her down. "You're going somewhere," Ruth said through the rolled-down window. "I'm getting some air." "Hazel Tipton Carraway," Ruth said, using both her maiden and married names the way she had since 1959. "You're not the kind of woman who gets air on a schedule." I'm getting some air. Ruth set the paper sack on the passenger seat. It was warm. It smelled like buttermilk biscuits. I'll come over to your house Saturday with a casserole, Ruth said, and you'll tell me whatever you are not telling me. In the meantime, eat the biscuits. Yes, ma'am? Hazel drove on. She ate the biscuits, standing at the counter inside the station. She ate them slowly, looking around the room, looking at the long work she had set herself. The first day, she swept. 6 decades of dust came up in soft gray clouds. She propped the front door open with a brick from the canopy, and she swept the dust out across the apron in long, careful strokes. She found, under the dust, things that had been waiting. A 1961 Sears Roebuck calendar tucked behind the stove. An Esso road map of Kentucky folded inside a tin Bonamo taffy box. A wooden Dr. Pepper crate with 2 intact bottles still in it, the caps red with rust. A pencil with deep teeth marks at one end lying in the dust behind the cash register. She picked the pencil up, and she held it, and she felt with absolute certainty that this pencil had been in her father's mouth, and she stood there in the cold afternoon light with that pencil pressed against her own lips until she was crying without noise. The second day, she washed the windows. The Murphy's oil soap left the glass clean enough to see Old Cumberland Pike through for the first time in 60 years. The third day, she scrubbed the floor on her hands and knees. She had bursitis in her left knee from 20 years of gardening, and she did the floor anyway. 6 square feet at a time, taking breaks every 10 minutes to sit on a folding chair and rest her hand on the warm radiator side of the coal stove that was not, in fact, warm at all. On the 4th day, she cleaned the coal stove. She found half a coal scuttle still in the bin behind it, and on a hunch, she split a log from the wood pile in the barn back home and brought it over the next morning. On the 5th day, she lit a fire in the stove for the first time since December 1962. The chimney drew at once, as if it had been remembering how. The little office filled with warm, dry wood smoke, and Hazel sat in the folding chair beside the stove and listened to the fire breathe and thought he would like that I lit a fire. On the 6th day, she did not light the fire. She did not sweep. She did not wash. She sat in the wooden ladder-back chair behind the counter, in her father's chair, with the National Brass cash register directly in front of her on the oak counter, and she faced it. She had been circling around it for 6 days. She had been ready to face it for 60 years. She put both her hands flat on the counter on either side of the register, and she took one long, slow breath, and she made herself look directly at the brass lever on the right side of the machine. The register was a National Model 442 from 1924. Hazel's father had bought it second-hand from a defunct druggist over in Glasgow in the spring of 1948, the year he opened the station and the year she was born, 2 events he liked to say his wife had handed him in the same week. The machine was heavy as a tombstone and twice as ornate, brass scrollwork rolling up its sides, an arched glass display along the top showing the engraved white-on-black amount tabs, 6 round black price keys arranged like piano keys along the lower face, and a single long brass lever on the right side polished to a soft gold by 60 years of her father's right hand. She put her right hand on the lever. She held it there for a moment without pulling. She thought of all the things she had pulled levers for in 72 years. The lever on her grandmother's washing machine. The lever on the shifter of the Pontiac she had driven home with Walter from their honeymoon. The lever on the casket-lowering machine at Walter's graveside service, which she had not been allowed to touch, but which she had stared at long enough to know the shape of. The lever on the porch swing where she had nursed Susan for the first 6 months of Susan's life. Some levers were made to lift you. Some levers were made to lower you. Some levers were just made to wait. She pulled. The drawer slid open with a clean musical bell chime, clear and bright as the day it was last closed. She had not expected it to be so clear. She had expected the rust and the ruin of 60 years. She had not expected a sound that fresh, a sound out of her childhood. A sound from afternoons when she had been allowed to stand on her father's wooden box behind the counter and ring up a 40-cent fill of regular for the man in the wheat truck. The drawer was open. The drawer was full. $43.18. She counted it twice without touching it. The bills had been folded in a particular way, long ways, then thirds, that she remembered, all at once and exactly, was the way her father folded singles before he tucked them under their dividers. There were 8 ones and 2 fives, and a single 10 and a $2 bill folded in half. There were Liberty quarters and Buffalo nickels and wheat pennies that had been minted before the war and had been retired from circulation by the time her own daughter was born. There was a silver dollar from 1923. None of it had been spent. None of it had been spent because no one had been here to spend it. This was the float her father had counted into the drawer on the evening of December 17, 1962, in the last 10 minutes before the kerosene stove failed and the back room caught and his life ended. This was the cash he had been arranging for the next day's business. This was the work he had put down in the middle of doing. She did not take any of it. She did not even touch it. She just looked. After a long while, she ran her right index finger gently along the wooden dividers that separated the bill slots from the coin trays. There were 6 dividers in all, simple, slim strips of cherry wood, each about 3 inches long. 5 sat snug in their grooves. 1, the second from the right, the divider between the 1s and the 5s, sat slightly proud of the others. 1/2 millimeter. The kind of crookedness no man would have left if he intended his work to be straightened. She pressed her thumbnail against the proud edge. The divider lifted free with a soft click. She set it on the counter beside the register. Beneath where it had sat, the floor of the drawer was hollow. Not the way a drawer is hollow, the way a hiding place is hollow. The hollow was lined with a square of waxed brown butcher paper, folded neatly into a tray shape and fitted to the empty space below. The paper was clean. The paper had not been touched in 63 years. Across the visible top of the butcher paper, in heavy pencil block letters drawn slowly and carefully by a man pressing harder than he needed to, were 6 lines. For my little Hazel, to be opened on her 18th birthday. July 4th, 1969. Do not open before. Joseph Tipton. She made a sound she would never be able to remember making afterwards. It was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when 63 years of a question are answered with 1 sentence written in pencil by a dead man. She put both hands on the counter. She bowed her head. She breathed. She had to wait. She did not know how long she sat there with her forehead pressed against the cool wood of the counter and her breath coming in short, slow pulls, but the small fire in the coal stove burned down to a single bright coal, and the light through the front window shifted from late morning yellow to pale noon white, and when she finally raised her head and reached again into the drawer, she had become a slightly different woman than she had been when she sat down. She lifted the square of butcher paper out of the hollow. Beneath it lay a manila envelope. It was the long bank deposit kind, pre-printed in dark green ink with the words, Bank of Holloway. Deposit across the front. Heavy, stuffed full. Sealed with 3 strips of cellulose tape that had yellowed to the color of weak tea, but had not let go. Across the front of the envelope, in the same heavy pencil printing as the butcher paper, Hazel's envelope. Do not open until July 4th, 1969. She lifted the envelope into her lap. She wept then, but quietly, the way her grandmother had taught her. Head bowed, shoulders still, breath kept inside the chest. Crying was a private thing in her family. Crying was something a woman did for herself and not for the room. She unsealed the tape gently with the edge of her thumbnail. She took out the contents one at a time, and she laid each item across the oak counter in the order it came out, and she did not weep again until the 3rd item. The first item was a thick wad of paper currency held with a brittle rubber band. Old bills, mostly 5s and 10s, a few 20s, several singles, all of them in series numbers that were retired from circulation by the early 1970s. She did not count them at first. She would count them later that evening, in her kitchen on Mill Hollow Road, alone at the oak table with the cat asleep on the radiator and the manila envelope laid open in front of her like an offering. She would count them 3 times. The total would come to $437 exact, which would feel, in 2026, like a small amount of money, and would also feel, all at once, like more money than she had ever held in her hand before in her life. The second item was a small black cloth-bound pocket ledger booklet, hand-stitched at the spine with cotton thread. She opened it. Across the top of the first page, in her father's blocky pencil printing, Hazel's College Fund. The columns were ruled: date, amount, running total. The first entry: August 7th, 1948, 50 cents, 50 cents, the week after she was born. The next entry: August 14th, 1948, 50 cents, $1. Every Saturday, every single Saturday for 14 years. She turned the pages slowly. 512 entries. He had stopped on December 14, 1962, 3 days before he died. The final running total entry in his hand: $256. The $437 in the rubber-banded wad meant he had been pulling cash out of his account elsewhere and adding it to the envelope after the last ledger entry, building it up against her 18th birthday 7 years away. The third item was a small round folded scrap of tissue paper. She unfolded it slowly. Inside the tissue paper was a thin gold ring, slightly worn smooth by years on a finger, set with a single tiny deep red garnet stone in a 4-prong setting. Her grandmother, Cora's, her father's mother's. The ring, she had been told by her mother in 1969 when she turned 18, did not exist. The ring, she had been told, had been pawned in 1932 during the worst of the Depression. The ring, her mother had said with absolute certainty. There is no ring, Hazel. There never was a ring. She held it in her open palm. She watched the cold winter light from the window catch and turn slowly inside the red stone. She thought, Mama lied. Mama lied for 57 years. She did not yet know why. She put the ring carefully back in its tissue paper. She reached into the envelope a final time. 4 folded pages of yellow legal pad paper came out together, creased into thirds, soft and dry as old butterfly wings. The letter. She unfolded the pages slowly. She laid them out across the oak counter side by side. 4 pages, yellow legal pad. The careful blocky pencil printing she now knew the way she knew the sound of her own breathing. She did not read silently. She had passed silent for the day. She read aloud, in the empty station, with the small fire in the stove crackling soft, and the snow falling outside on Old Cumberland Pike, and the Texaco wall clock above the door still stopped at 8:47 from a December evening 63 years ago. My little Hazel, I am writing this to you on the 4th of July, 1962. You are 11 years old, and you're out in the front yard right now running the sparkler. Your mother does not know I bought you, and I am at the kitchen table with a glass of iced tea and a yellow pad and a sharpened pencil. And I'm writing to you about some things a man my age has begun to think he ought to write down. I am 38 years old. My own father died at 41, which I am told by Doc Pinson means nothing for me, but which I am also told by my own quiet sense of these things may mean something for me. So I am writing. You will be 18 on July 4th, 1969. The bicentennial of this country will be 7 years past, but for you it will be the bicentennial of yourself. You will be old enough to leave this town. I hope you do. I hope you go to college, baby. I hope you study something hard. I hope you marry a man who knows how to laugh, and I hope he laughs first and last and most. I hope you have a daughter, and I hope you name her something old-fashioned and pretty. I am writing this letter because I want to give you in 7 years an envelope that has waited for you in the second drawer of my cash register from the day you were born. That envelope will have inside it the savings I have put away from this station, 50 cents at a time every Saturday since the week you came home from the hospital. The math at 50 cents a week says I will have given you about $360 by the time you turn 18, but I'm going to make it $400, even if I have to skip a haircut or two, and I might add some extra from time to time if a good month comes around at the pumps. I want it to pay for something good. Your college, if you go. Your business, if you start one. Your wedding ride, if you elope, which I support if the man is worth it. Your first house, if you are the kind who saves like your old man. I do not want your mother to know about it because she worries about money in a particular way that would make her spend it on the roof or the boiler or some other necessary thing. You are also a necessary thing, Hazel. The roof and the boiler are not more necessary than you. You will find in this envelope a small gold ring with a single red stone. That is your grandmother Cora's ring. Your mother believes I sold it in 1932. I did not sell it. I hid it in the bottom of a flower tin for 17 years, and then I hid it here for 13 more. And now it is yours. Your grandmother wanted it to go to a granddaughter. You are the only granddaughter she will ever have. Wear it on your right hand. Save it for your own granddaughter one day if you can. I want to say something else to you, Hazel. I want to say it now in case I do not get to say it later. Your mother loves you the way she loves the weather. By accounting for it, by preparing for it, by knowing every cloud and being ready for every rain. That is love. That is real love. Do not let anyone tell you it is not. But I love you the way I love a song I cannot stop humming. You walked into the station last Saturday afternoon at 3 minutes after 4, and you were eating a chocolate ice cream, and you had a smear of it on your chin, and you stood in front of the candy case, and you hummed, without knowing you were humming, a hymn we sing in church called Shall We Gather at the River. And I stood there behind the counter, and I watched you, and I thought, Joseph, this little girl is the very best work of your hands. I have not been able to stop thinking of that moment all summer. If I am there to give you this letter on your 18th birthday, you will think me a sentimental fool, and you will hug me, and I will be embarrassed, and we will go to the Dairy Queen and have a cone. If I am not there, then know I was thinking of you when I wrote this, and I will be thinking of you whenever you read it. Your mother loves you fierce, but I have loved you patient. There is room in a girl's life for both kinds of love. Your Pop. Joe Tipton. She read the 4 pages once aloud. Then she read them a second time aloud, slower. Then she folded them carefully back into thirds, and she laid them on the counter, and she sat in her father's wooden ladder-back chair for an hour and a half without moving, while the snow kept falling outside on Old Cumberland Pike. She did not weep at the end. She had wept herself through. She felt, for the first time in 14 months, and possibly for the first time in 63 years, that she had been held. She slept a long time that night. She slept the way she had not slept since Walter first got sick. In the morning, she put the manila envelope in the canvas tote bag Susan had given her last Christmas, and she drove out to the Holloway care home on the south end of town, and she asked the woman at the front desk if Mr. Earl Whitaker was receiving visitors. The woman, whose name tag said Brittany, looked up Mr. Whitaker on her tablet. He doesn't get many visitors, ma'am. His daughter comes Wednesdays. You family? I'm Joe Tipton's girl. Brittany lowered her tablet. She looked at Hazel for a long moment. Mr. Earl will be glad, she said softly. He's in the South Day room. Hazel walked down the hall. Earl Whitaker was 78. He sat in a wheelchair by the tall south window of the day room with a wool-plaid blanket across his lap. His hair was thin and silver, combed straight back. His face was deeply lined with the sun and 78 winters of Kentucky weather. His hands rested on the blanket, large, work-roughened, knuckled, the hands of a man who had pumped a great deal of gas and changed a great deal of oil. He was watching a bare maple tree out the window. He did not turn his head when she walked in. She came around in front of him. Mr. Whitaker, she said, I'm Joe Tipton's girl, Hazel. His eyes came up to her face. They went wet at once, without warning. "Little Hazel," he said. His voice was high and thin like a thread coming through a needle. "Your daddy talked about you every shift. Every single one. Every single one of them." She pulled a chair over and sat in front of him. He held out one of his hands. She took it. His skin was paper-thin and his knuckles were like walnut shells, but his grip was sure. He had worked at her father's station from August of 1959 to January of 1963, 3.5 years, the last full year of the station's life. He had been 17 when he started. He had pumped gas, swept the apron, washed windshields, learned how to change oil and rotate tires from her father. He told her now, in the south day room of the Holloway care home with the bare maple swaying outside the window, the things he had been carrying for 63 years. He told her her father was the quietest man he ever knew. He told her her father hummed "Shall We Gather at the River" while he worked under cars. He told her her father kept a tin of butterscotch candies under the counter for the kids who came in. He told her her father never raised his voice once. He told her her father drank his coffee black and ate a single hard-boiled egg every morning and would not eat sweets at lunch but kept a sleeve of saltines in his apron pocket. He told her her father saw a young man come into the station drunk one Friday night, and rather than turn him away gave him a pot of coffee and a chair by the stove and made him sober before he let him drive. He told her father had loved her, Hazel, every minute of every day. He told her about the night her father died. The kerosene stove in the back room had a known leak. Her father had been planning to replace it after Christmas. December 17th, 1962 was the coldest evening of that winter, 14 below, with a wind. Her father had stayed late doing the books. The stove failed. The back room caught. He had gotten out the front door. He had been standing on the apron, in the cold, safe. Then he had remembered the day's float, $43.18 the next morning's working cash, and he had turned around and gone back inside, the way her father went toward responsibilities he had set himself. And that was when the line ruptured and the front room blew. He was thinking about the next day, Hazel? Your daddy died thinking about the next day. Earl held her hand. He held it with both of his. They sat in the south day room until the bare maple tree gave up its last bit of afternoon light, and the orderly came around with the dinner trays. Susan Carraway Pratt drove down from Lexington that Saturday morning. She was 47. She wore a wool coat the color of camel hair and ankle boots that were the wrong choice for the kind of weather a country station has in February. She drove a Volvo. She had not been to Holloway in 11 months. She had not been inside the old service station, ever, in her whole life. She had not come to look at the station, however. She had come to tell her mother that the purchase had been foolish, that the money should have been kept in the church jar, that it was time to talk about Cedar Grove the way grown women talk about hard things by writing it down in a list and going through it. She had the list folded in the inner pocket of her coat. She had written it on Friday night at her kitchen table in Lexington with a glass of Cabernet and a husband who had quietly disagreed with the whole undertaking, but who had also been married to Susan for 23 years and had learned where to keep his disagreements. She parked the Volvo on the gravel shoulder of Old Cumberland Pike. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment looking out at the small white clapboard station. Smoke was coming from the chimney. The front door was propped open with a brick. She walked across the cracked asphalt apron in her wrong boots, and she stepped through the front door. She had not expected what she saw. The floor was clean. The windows were clean. The Texaco wall clock above the door was still stopped at 8:47, but the brass face of it had been polished and it gleamed. The coal stove in the corner was lit, and there was a soft fire in it, and the small office was warm. The oak counter was clean and polished, and on the counter, neatly arranged in 4 small piles, were 437 old paper dollars, a black cloth ledger, a folded scrap of tissue paper, and 4 pages of yellow legal pad laid out side by side. Her mother sat in a wooden ladder-back chair behind the counter. Her hands were folded in her lap. She looked up at her daughter and she did not say hello. She just held out the 4 yellow pages of the letter. "Read this, Susan." Susan came to the counter. She took the pages. She did not sit. She read them standing at the counter, the way she would read a brief at her office in Lexington, and on the second page her hand went up to her mouth, and on the third page she sat down hard on a folding chair Hazel had set there the day before for company, and by the fourth page Susan Carraway Pratt, who had not cried in her mother's presence since her own husband had not been picked for the Lexington bar in 2007, was crying without sound. Susan had not met her grandfather, Joe. He had died 9 years before she was born. She had grown up hearing about him only once, sourly, from her grandmother Lillian, when Susan was 9 and had asked. Lillian had said, "Your Grandpa Joe wasn't worth the paper of his obituary, Susan, and that is the last I will say of him." Susan had not asked again. She had grown up believing he was a shadow man, a thin disappointment, a hole in her family she had been told not to look at. The letter rewrote him. When she had read the last line, Susan set the pages down carefully on the counter. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She looked at her mother for a long moment. She said very quietly, "Mama, I am so sorry." "For what, baby?" "For everything she made you carry, for everything I didn't ask you about, for Cedar Grove." Hazel did not say anything. She reached across the counter and put her hand over Susan's hand. After a while, Susan asked, in a voice that was different from any voice Hazel had heard her daughter use in 20 years, "What are you going to do with this place, Mama?" "I'm going to open it, just the front room. Coffee and pie, 2 chairs and a counter. Some place for people to sit. I'm going to call it Joe's Place." Susan opened her mouth to say something practical about the medical debt, about the Volvo payment, about the realistic income of a coffee and pie operation in a Kentucky town of 1,900 souls. She closed her mouth again. She said, "Okay, Mama, okay. Let me help you." She took off her camel hair coat and she draped it across the folding chair. She rolled up the sleeves of her cream blouse. She came around behind the counter. She picked up a clean rag from the pile her mother had left there. She started, without being told, on the inside of the glass display case where the desiccated candy bars from 1962 had been removed, but the dust had not yet been gotten to. They worked together until the south light went pink. Joe's Place opened on Easter Sunday, the 5th of April, 2026. The work had taken 6 weeks. Ruth Donnelly had come over after closing the bakery each evening with a thermos and a casserole and her own pair of work gloves. Susan had driven down every weekend with the Volvo loaded with painter's tape and Murphy's oil soap, and once with a small antique cast-iron coffee urn she had found in an estate sale in Versailles. Earl Whitaker's son-in-law had come over one Saturday with a ladder and rebolted the leaning Texaco star sign on the pole. Lloyd, from the post office, had touched up the Texaco red trim around the canopy in his own time, without being asked. The volunteer fire department, who had been the men to put out the kerosene fire on December 17, 1962, sent 2 of their younger members on a weekday afternoon to clear the pin oak branches from the canopy roof. The pumps were preserved as monuments, polished and sealed, never to dispense gas again. The Texaco star sign was repainted bright red and white. The little white clapboard office wore a fresh coat of soft cream paint. A hand-painted wooden sign above the door read, in warm, hand-lettered gold, "Joe's Place." Inside, the front room held 4 small wooden tables and 16 wooden chairs, all of them found in barns or estate sales or under tarps in church basements within 15 miles of Holloway. A cast-iron coffee urn sat on the oak counter. Under glass on the counter were Ruth's pies, peach, apple, lemon meringue, and a single Bonamo Turkish taffy-inspired chess pie that had been Ruth's idea and that Hazel had agreed to only with reservations. On the back wall, behind glass in a hand-built oak frame Susan's husband had made, hung the 4 pages of the letter. Beside the letter, in a smaller frame, hung the black cloth-bound ledger booklet, opened to its first page. Beside that hung the original brass key on its leather fob, the one Bobby Pruitt had slid across his counter in February. And beside that hung the small Texaco-branded wall calendar from December 1962, the page still open with its red circle around the 17th. The grandmother's garnet ring was on Hazel's right pinky finger. The worn gold wedding band from Walter was on her left ring finger. She had worried for a week about whether the two could rest on her hands together. They could. Two loves could rest together. The arithmetic of a woman's life was bigger than the arithmetic of her debt. Easter on Sunday morning came up clear and cool. Hazel arrived at 6. She lit the fire in the coal stove. She filled the coffee urn. She set out the cream and the sugar. She turned the small wooden open sign on the front door outward, and she went to stand on the front step, and at 7:30 in the morning, with the pink dogwood blossoms drifting across the apron in the spring breeze, Earl Whitaker was wheeled up the sidewalk by his granddaughter, and Hazel held the door for him, and Earl was the first person to come in. He sat at the corner table, the same corner where Joe Tipton, his old boss and her late father, had once taken coffee with the regulars between fill-ups. Hazel poured Earl the first cup. Susan brought him a slice of peach pie. Ruth came out from behind the counter, and Lloyd came in next with his cap in his hand. And behind Lloyd came the volunteer firemen, and behind them came Janet Pruitt, who had taught Hazel typing in 1968, and behind Janet came Bobby Pruitt, the town clerk, with his young wife, and behind them came a line of small-town folks in their Easter clothes that stretched out the door and down the sidewalk for 50 yards. The bell above the door rang every time someone came in. The medical debt was still $52,000 and change. The farmhouse on Mill Hollow Road still needed paint, and the barn still needed a new roof, and the Volvo was still going to make Susan an hour-long drive every weekend. But the question that Hazel Carraway had carried inside her chest for 63 years, the question of whether her father had loved her, the question of whether she had been worth a man's patient love, the question of whether a quiet man in a coal-stove-warm filling station office had thought of her between every fill-up, had been answered. It had been answered in pencil, 50 cents at a time, every Saturday for 14 years, in a black cloth ledger hidden beneath a divider in a brass cash register on the corner of Old Cumberland Pike and Spruce Street in Holloway, Kentucky. The clock above the door, polished but still stopped at 8:47, did not tick. It did not need to. Time had done what it needed to do. And outside, on the corner of Old Cumberland Pike and Spruce Street, a small white-clappered service station that had stood empty for 35 years, was finally, gently, home.